The moment the laughter started, nobody in cell block D realized they were witnessing the biggest mistake of their lives. The steel doors slid open with a heavy metallic groan that echoed through the housing unit, a sound every inmate recognized instantly. Conversations slowed. Card games paused. Even the television mounted high in the corner seemed less important for a moment. New arrivals always attracted attention. In a place where every day looked exactly like the one before it, anything different became entertainment. The correctional officer stepped through first, his boots striking the concrete floor with practiced authority. Behind him walked a man who looked completely out of place. He was old. Not prison old. Truly old. The kind of old that made people wonder how he managed to get through a regular day, let alone survive inside one of the toughest correctional facilities in the state. His name was Elijah Brooks. 72 years old. Dark skin weathered by decades beneath the American sun. Thin silver hair cropped close to his scalp. A pair of reading glasses rested in the front pocket of his prison uniform. He carried a small mesh bag containing the few personal items the prison allowed him to keep. Nothing about him appeared threatening. Nothing about him suggested danger. If anything, he looked more like a retired schoolteacher than an inmate. The laughter started from a table near the center of the block. One man chuckled. Another joined in. Then the entire room seemed to catch the same contagious amusement. Within seconds, dozens of inmates were staring directly at Elijah. Some shook their heads. Others exchanged grins. A few openly pointed. Somebody's grandpa got lost on the way to the retirement home, one voice called out. More laughter followed. Elijah didn't react. Not even a glance. Not even the smallest sign of annoyance. He simply continued walking beside the officer with the same calm expression he had worn since entering the building. That only made the laughter louder. Cell block D wasn't known for kindness. It was known for hierarchy, power, reputation. Every inmate understood the unspoken rules. The strong controlled the weak. The respected controlled everyone else. New arrivals spent their first few days proving where they belonged. Elijah Brooks looked like he belonged nowhere. A tall inmate leaned against the second-floor railing and stared down at him. "He won't last a week," he announced. Several inmates nodded in agreement. One man claimed Elijah wouldn't survive until the weekend. Another suggested he wouldn't make it through his first night. The predictions spread quickly through the block like wildfire. Yet through all of it, Elijah remained completely silent. The officer led him toward the staircase connecting the lower level to the upper tier. Every eye followed him. Every conversation somehow revolved around him. But there was something strange about the old man. Something difficult to explain. He never looked nervous. He never looked confused. He never looked afraid. Most new inmates arrived carrying visible tension. Their eyes darted around the room. Their shoulders stayed tight. Their movements revealed uncertainty. Elijah displayed none of those things. Instead, he moved with quiet purpose. His pace was slow but steady. His posture remained straight despite his age. His eyes drifted across the block, taking in every corner, every face, every detail. Not like a frightened newcomer. More like someone studying a place he already understood. Nobody noticed it. Nobody except one person. Officer Rebecca Hayes stood near the control station reviewing paperwork. She had worked corrections for nearly 15 years. Experience had taught her how to read people. Most inmates revealed themselves within seconds. Fear, anger, arrogance, desperation. She recognized all of them immediately. But Elijah Brooks gave away nothing. As he disappeared onto the upper tier, she found herself watching him longer than necessary. Something about him felt unusual. Not dangerous, just unusual. She glanced down at the intake file resting on her clipboard. The paperwork seemed thinner than normal, almost incomplete. Before she could examine it further, another officer called her name. The moment passed. Above them, Elijah reached his assigned cell. The laughter below continued. Jokes echoed through the housing unit. Mocking comments bounced from table to table. Nobody knew it yet. Nobody could have known. But 3 days later, not a single person in cell block D would be laughing anymore. The first night settled over cell block D with the familiar rhythm of steel doors locking into place and distant voices fading into the background. From his upper-tier cell, Elijah Brooks sat quietly on the edge of his bunk while the rest of the housing unit continued discussing him. Some inmates treated him like a joke. Others barely considered him worth mentioning anymore. In prison, attention moved quickly. New arrivals were entertainment until something newer appeared. Yet even as the block settled into its evening routine, Elijah remained awake, his hands folded loosely in his lap, his eyes fixed on the narrow window that revealed a sliver of dark sky beyond the razor wire. Across the cell, his assigned cellmate, a nervous 30-year-old inmate named Aaron Miller, could not stop looking at him. Aaron had spent nearly 3 years inside and considered himself a decent judge of character. The old man confused him. Most newcomers asked questions. They wanted advice. They wanted protection. They wanted to understand the rules. Elijah had asked for nothing. After nearly an hour of silence, Aaron finally spoke. "You know they are all talking about you, right?" Elijah shifted his gaze toward him and offered a faint smile. "People often talk when they do not know someone." Aaron laughed quietly. "That is one way to put it." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Aaron noticed something unusual. Elijah was making notes in a small prison-issued notebook. Not names, not complaints, not legal arguments. He appeared to be sketching. "What are you drawing?" Aaron asked. Elijah glanced down at the page. "Observations." "Observations of what?" Elijah closed the notebook. "Everything." The answer should have sounded strange. Instead, it sounded deliberate. Down below, a loud burst of laughter erupted from one of the tables. Travis Cole sat surrounded by his usual circle of followers. His voice carried easily across the housing unit. He was telling another joke about the old newcomer. Several inmates joined in. Others simply listened. Travis enjoyed being the center of attention. He had spent years building that reputation. What bothered him slightly was the fact that Elijah had not reacted once. Not anger, not embarrassment, not fear. Nothing. Most people eventually responded. Elijah had not. The next morning arrived with fluorescent lights flickering to life at exactly 5:30. Cell doors opened. Inmates poured into the corridors. Breakfast lines formed. The usual chaos resumed. Elijah moved through it all with the same calm pace. He accepted his tray, thanked the kitchen worker, and searched for an empty seat. Conversation slowed again as he passed. A few comments followed him. A few chuckles echoed behind him. Yet Elijah never turned around. He simply sat alone near the far corner of the cafeteria and began eating. Officer Rebecca Hayes watched from across the room. Something about the old man continued to pull at her attention. She had reviewed hundreds of intake files throughout her career. Yet Elijah's file remained oddly incomplete. Earlier that morning, she had attempted to access additional records through the prison database. The screen displayed a message she had never seen before. Access restricted. Federal authorization required. She stared at the notice for several seconds before checking the inmate identification number again. Same result. Restricted. The feeling lingered with her throughout the morning. Back in the cafeteria, another inmate approached Elijah's table. A younger man carrying himself with the confidence that often came from having an audience. Several nearby inmates watched with interest. The newcomer stopped beside Elijah and glanced at the empty chair across from him. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked. Elijah looked up and nodded politely. "Not at all." The inmate pulled out the chair, but paused halfway through the motion. Something about Elijah's eyes made him hesitate. It lasted less than a second. Barely noticeable. Yet for reasons he could not explain, he suddenly felt as though he were standing in front of someone who saw far more than he should. The feeling disappeared as quickly as it came. He laughed it off and sat down. Around them, life inside the prison continued exactly as before. But somewhere beneath the surface, something had already begun to change. 3 days later, nobody in cell block D was laughing anymore. The change had not happened all at once. There had been no dramatic announcement, no obvious turning point that everyone could point to afterward. Instead, it arrived the way storms often did on the Great Plains. Quietly at first, almost unnoticed, then suddenly impossible to ignore. On the afternoon of Elijah Brooks's 3rd day inside, the recreation yard buzzed with its usual noise. Basketballs struck concrete. Small groups gathered beneath the fences. Conversations drifted through the warm air. Elijah occupied a bench near the edge of the yard, sitting alone with a library book resting in his hands. He seemed completely detached from the competition and posturing surrounding him. Yet several inmates had started watching him. Not because he had done anything remarkable. Quite the opposite. The more they observed him, the stranger his calm appeared. Most people reacted to prison. Elijah seemed to absorb it without resistance. Aaron Miller noticed it first. During breakfast, Elijah always arrived within 30 seconds of the doors opening. During count, he stood in exactly the same position every time. During recreation, he selected different locations but somehow maintained a clear view of every entrance, every walkway, and every gathering place. Aaron initially assumed it was coincidence. By the third day, coincidence no longer felt like the right explanation. Nearby, Travis Cole watched from across the yard. The leader of Cell Block D was not accustomed to being ignored. People usually sought his approval or feared his attention. Elijah did neither. It irritated him more than he cared to admit. Several members of his group had attempted conversations with the old man over the previous 2 days. Each interaction ended the same way. Elijah remained polite, respectful, unshaken. It was difficult to intimidate someone who refused to participate in the game. Travis finally stood and walked toward the bench. Conversations softened as inmates noticed the movement. Not because they expected trouble. They simply understood that Travis rarely approached anyone without a reason. Elijah looked up from his book as the shadow fell across the page. Travis folded his arms. "You know who I am?" he asked. Elijah closed the book carefully before answering. "I know your name is Travis Cole." The response caught several nearby inmates by surprise. Travis narrowed his eyes. "Then you know this block operates a certain way." Elijah nodded once. "Every place operates a certain way. And what does that mean?" Travis asked. A faint smile touched Elijah's face. "It means people reveal themselves eventually." The answer lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Travis stared at him for a moment before shaking his head. "You talk like a professor." "I was a teacher once," Elijah replied. Travis laughed. Several others joined him. Yet something about the exchange felt different. Elijah had not challenged him. He had not submitted either. Somehow he had answered without giving anything away. Travis eventually walked back toward his group, but the conversation stayed with him. Later that evening, Officer Rebecca Hayes sat alone in the administrative office after her shift officially ended. The prison database glowed softly on the computer monitor. Elijah's restricted file remained open on the screen. Curiosity had finally overcome caution. She submitted another request for authorization. The system processed the request for several seconds before displaying a response. "Access denied. Additional clearance required." Then a second message appeared beneath it. "Record activity logged." Rebecca frowned. She had never seen that notification before. Most inmate files were ordinary. This one clearly was not. Meanwhile, upstairs in Cell Block D, Elijah returned to his cell carrying another library book. As he passed several inmates, conversations stopped momentarily. The laughter was gone now. In its place stood something else. Uncertainty. People had started realizing they knew almost nothing about him. And in a place where information was power, mystery had a way of becoming its own kind of authority. Nobody understood what they were looking at yet. But for the first time since Elijah Brooks arrived, the questions had become louder than the jokes. Long before Elijah Brooks arrived at Graystone Correctional Facility, Cell Block D had belonged to Travis Cole. Not officially. The prison administration would never admit such a thing. According to every handbook, every policy manual, and every staff briefing, authority rested with the correctional officers. Reality looked different. For nearly 8 years, Travis had built a reputation that stretched far beyond the walls of the housing unit. New inmates learned his name before they learned the daily schedule. Veteran inmates measured their decisions against his reactions. Even simple routines often revolved around the invisible influence he carried. He understood people. He understood fear. Most importantly, he understood how to make himself appear larger than life. By the age of 38, Travis had become the center of an entire ecosystem. His table in the cafeteria remained occupied by the same loyal circle every day. His workout group dominated the recreation yard. His opinions spread through the block faster than official announcements. Many inmates respected him. Others simply preferred avoiding conflict. Either way, the result remained the same. Travis Cole rarely encountered anyone who ignored him. That was why Elijah bothered him. The old man had done nothing wrong. Yet somehow that made things worse. Every attempt to place Elijah into a familiar category failed. He was not frightened. He was not arrogant. He was not trying to impress anyone. It felt as though he had arrived carrying an invisible shield that nobody else could see. Late that evening, Travis sat at his usual table surrounded by half a dozen inmates. The television played quietly overhead, while conversations drifted across the room. Yet the discussion eventually returned to the same subject. Elijah Brooks. Something is off about him, one inmate admitted. Travis rolled his eyes. He is 72 years old. Maybe. The inmate lowered his voice. But have you ever seen somebody that calm in here? Travis leaned back in his chair. The question irritated him because he had already been asking himself the same thing. Across the block, Elijah sat alone near the upper railing reading beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The noise below never seemed to affect him. The laughter was gone now. In its place came observation. People watched him the way hikers watch a distant storm cloud, unsure whether it mattered but unable to look away. Meanwhile, Officer Rebecca Hayes continued her own investigation. The following morning, she requested access through a different internal system normally used for historical records. She expected another denial. Instead, she found something even stranger. Elijah Brooks had almost no digital history before his conviction. No employment records. No public interviews. No photographs available through standard databases. It was as though entire decades of his life had been carefully removed. Rebecca stared at the screen. That was impossible. Everyone left a trail. Tax records. Licenses. Property ownership. Something. Yet Elijah seemed to exist inside a fog. One line, near the bottom, finally caught her attention. It referenced a federal agency. The remaining information had been redacted. Rebecca felt a chill travel down her spine. In 15 years of corrections work, she had never encountered an inmate whose background generated this many barriers. Back in cell block D, another unusual moment unfolded during afternoon recreation. A former Marine named Daniel Mercer had spent most of his sentence keeping to himself. He rarely paid attention to prison gossip. But as Elijah crossed the yard carrying 2 library books beneath his arm, Daniel's expression changed. His eyes narrowed slightly. He watched the old man move across the concrete pathway. Not the speed. Not the posture. Something else. The way he scanned the environment. The way he unconsciously positioned himself with a clear view of every approach. Daniel had seen that behavior before. Years ago, in places far removed from prison walls. The realization unsettled him. He continued watching until Elijah disappeared through the recreation entrance. Then he quietly whispered for words that nobody nearby understood. That cannot be possible. The question Daniel Mercer asked himself followed him throughout the rest of the day. He had spent 8 years in the Marine Corps before life took a series of wrong turns that eventually landed him behind prison walls. During those years of service, he had met instructors, advisors, and specialists from places most Americans would never hear about. Men who carried themselves differently. Men who could walk into a crowded room and somehow notice every detail without appearing to look at anything at all. Elijah Brooks reminded him of those people. That realization refused to leave his mind. During evening recreation, Daniel found himself standing near the upper railing as Elijah slowly crossed the housing unit below. The old man carried another library book beneath one arm. Nothing unusual about that. He stopped briefly to allow another inmate to pass through a narrow corridor. Nothing unusual about that either. Yet Daniel noticed something almost nobody else saw. Elijah never turned his back completely toward anyone. His movements appeared casual, but every adjustment seemed intentional. Every position offered visibility. Every pause created awareness. Most people would never recognize the pattern. Daniel did. Across the room, Aaron Miller had begun noticing changes as well. Not in Elijah. In everyone else. 3 days earlier, inmates openly mocked the newcomer. Now conversations lowered whenever his name appeared. Curiosity had replaced amusement. Aaron watched as 2 inmates discussed theories about Elijah's past. One believed he had once been a wealthy businessman. Another suggested he might have worked for the government. Neither explanation made much sense, but that only fueled the speculation. Humans disliked mysteries. Prisoners disliked them even more. Meanwhile, Officer Rebecca Hayes continued searching for answers. After another unsuccessful attempt to access Elijah's file, she decided to contact a colleague working in records administration. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. It left her more confused than before. The administrator recognized Elijah's identification number immediately, not because of the inmate himself, but because unusual restrictions had automatically flagged the record when it entered the state prison system. "I would stop digging if I were you," the administrator finally said. "Why?" Rebecca asked. Silence lingered for several seconds. Because somebody much higher than us does not want those records opened. The call ended shortly afterward. Rebecca stared at the phone resting on her desk. In 15 years, nobody had ever given her that advice. Back inside cell block D, the evening count concluded and inmates gradually returned to their routines. Television noise drifted through the housing unit. Card games resumed. Yet Elijah remained focused on his reading. Aaron eventually looked over from the opposite bunk. "Can I ask you something?" Elijah lowered the book slightly. "Of course. What did you do before prison?" Aaron expected hesitation. Instead, Elijah smiled gently. "Many things. That is not really an answer. Most honest answers are incomplete," Elijah replied. Aaron laughed despite himself. "You always talk like that." "Talk like what?" "Like every sentence belongs in a book." Elijah chuckled quietly. "Maybe I have spent too much time around books." The conversation ended there, but Aaron could not shake the feeling that Elijah had answered without revealing anything. It happened every time. Questions went in. Answers came out. Yet the mystery somehow grew larger. Later that night, after lights out, Daniel Mercer lay awake staring at the ceiling. Memories from years earlier drifted through his mind. Training facilities, classified briefings, senior advisors whose names never appeared on official paperwork. One memory surfaced stronger than the others. A photograph hanging on a conference room wall. A group picture taken decades earlier. Daniel could not remember the names. He could not even remember the event. But he remembered one face. An older black man standing near the center of the image. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Daniel sat upright in his bunk. His pulse quickened. "No," he whispered into the darkness. "It cannot be." Yet for the first time since Elijah Brooks arrived at Graystone Correctional Facility, someone inside cell block D was beginning to suspect that the truth might be far bigger than anyone imagined. The following morning arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds that pressed against the narrow prison windows. Inside cell block D, routines unfolded exactly as they always had. Doors opened. Breakfast trays moved through the cafeteria line. Conversations drifted from table to table. Yet beneath the familiar surface, something subtle had changed. The questions surrounding Elijah Brooks continued growing. Daniel Mercer spent most of breakfast watching from a distance. He hated uncertainty, and the old man represented nothing else. The memory from the photograph remained lodged in his mind. He could not remember where he had seen it. He could not remember why it mattered. But every instinct told him it was important. Across the room, Elijah sat alone with a cup of coffee and a paperback novel. As usual, he appeared completely comfortable in his surroundings. Not happy, not unhappy, simply present. Aaron Miller eventually joined him. "You ever get tired of being alone?" he asked. Elijah looked up from his book. Being alone and being lonely are different things. Aaron smiled. "There you go again. Again. Answering questions with answers that create more questions." Elijah chuckled softly. "Maybe that is because life works that way." Aaron shook his head. Yet he found himself smiling anyway. Around them, inmates continued sneaking glances toward the old man. The attention no longer felt hostile. It felt investigative. Everyone wanted to know something. Nobody knew where to begin. Later that afternoon, Officer Rebecca Hayes received an unexpected visitor in the administration office. Deputy Warden Frank Simmons rarely came downstairs without a reason. His arrival immediately captured her attention. "You have been looking into inmate Brooks," Simmons said. Rebecca hesitated. "I have looked at his file." "Stop looking." The response came so quickly that it almost sounded rehearsed. Rebecca frowned. "Why?" Simmons studied her for several seconds. "Because sometimes curiosity creates problems." "That is not an answer." "It is the only answer you are getting." The deputy warden turned and left before she could ask another question. Rebecca stared after him. The encounter only deepened her suspicion. Whatever surrounded Elijah Brooks reached far beyond ordinary prison administration. Back in the housing unit, another strange event unfolded. During recreation, several inmates gathered around one of the televisions to watch an afternoon news program. The segment focused on a ceremony taking place in Washington, D.C. Military officials stood beside government leaders as awards were presented to veterans and public servants. Most inmates ignored it. Daniel Mercer did not. Neither did Elijah. For a brief moment, the camera panned across a large display board featuring historical photographs from previous decades. The image appeared for less than 2 seconds before disappearing. Yet Daniel froze. His eyes widened. His pulse quickened. He had seen that photograph before. Not something similar. The exact photograph. More importantly, he recognized one of the men standing near the center. Older now. Gray-haired now. But unmistakable. Daniel immediately looked toward Elijah. The old man continued reading his book as though nothing had happened. As though he had not just appeared in a photograph connected to a national event. Daniel slowly sat down. A dozen thoughts raced through his mind. None of them made sense. Across the room, Travis Cole noticed Daniel's reaction. He noticed everything unusual inside cell block D. "What is wrong with you?" Travis asked. Daniel hesitated. "Nothing. That looked like something." Daniel considered explaining. Instead, he remained silent. Some instincts existed for a reason, and every instinct he possessed warned him against discussing what he thought he had just seen. As evening approached, a heavy rain began falling outside the prison walls. Water streaked across the narrow windows while distant thunder rolled through the darkening sky. Inside his cell, Elijah closed his book and looked toward the storm. For the first time since arriving at Graystone Correctional Facility, a faint expression crossed his face. Not fear, not concern, recognition, as though the weather had reminded him of something long forgotten, something important. And somewhere deep inside cell block D, the feeling continued spreading that a story far larger than anyone imagined was slowly beginning to reveal itself. The storm continued through the night, rattling the narrow windows and washing the prison yard beneath sheets of cold rain. By morning, the atmosphere inside Graystone felt different. Not because of the weather, because rumors had started moving faster than facts. Cell block D had always thrived on stories. Most lasted a few hours before disappearing. This one refused to die. Daniel Mercer sat alone at breakfast replaying the television broadcast from the previous afternoon. The image had flashed across the screen so quickly that most people never noticed it. Yet Daniel had noticed. More importantly, he had recognized it. He could not explain how. He could not even prove what he thought he had seen. But the feeling remained. Across the cafeteria, Elijah Brooks quietly stirred his coffee while reading another library book. He looked exactly the same as he had on the day he arrived. Calm, patient, uninterested in attention. That should have made the rumors fade. Instead, it made them stronger. "You know something about him," Aaron Miller said as he slid into the seat across from Daniel. Daniel looked up. "Why would you think that?" "Because every time somebody mentions Elijah, you get that look." "What look?" Aaron leaned forward. "The look people get when they know more than they are saying." Daniel glanced across the room toward the old man. "I am not sure what I know." "That sounds like a yes." Daniel remained silent. Sometimes silence answered questions better than words. Nearby, Travis Cole watched the exchange from his usual table. He did not like uncertainty. He especially did not like uncertainty involving someone inside his block. For nearly a week, Elijah had managed to attract attention without seeking it. That alone made him different. Travis had spent years understanding people. Most men wanted something. Respect, influence, protection, status. Elijah seemed to want none of those things. It bothered him more each day. Later that afternoon, Officer Rebecca Hayes finally received a response to one of her inquiries. It arrived through an internal message marked confidential. Her pulse quickened as she opened it. The message contained only a single sentence. "Further investigation into inmate Elijah Brooks is not authorized." No explanation. No signature. No additional information. Rebecca stared at the screen. In 15 years, she had never encountered an inmate whose records generated so much resistance. It was as though invisible walls existed around his past. Every path led nowhere. Every question ended the same way. "Stop asking." Meanwhile, Elijah spent the afternoon in the prison library. The room remained mostly empty except for a few inmates and an elderly volunteer who organized donated books. As Elijah approached the checkout desk, the volunteer looked up and smiled. "You have finished 3 books already." Elijah returned the smile. "Books make good company. You must have read a lot before coming here." For a brief moment, something changed in Elijah's eyes. Not sadness, not regret. Memory. "Yes," he said softly. "A very long time ago." The volunteer nodded and handed him another novel. The exchange lasted only seconds, but an inmate sitting nearby overheard it. By evening, a new rumor had joined the others. Some claimed Elijah had once been a professor. Others insisted he had worked for the government. One inmate swore he had seen military personnel visit prisons before and said Elijah carried himself the same way. Nobody knew the truth. Yet the mystery continued growing. As night settled over Graystone, Daniel stood alone near the upper railing overlooking the housing unit. Below him, dozens of inmates moved through their routines. Television screens flickered. Conversations rose and fell. At a small table near the far corner, Elijah sat reading beneath the fluorescent lights. Then something unexpected happened. A correctional officer entered the block carrying a stack of paperwork. He stopped beside Elijah and quietly handed him an envelope. Several inmates noticed immediately. Mail arrived every day, but this envelope was different. Official, government-issued. The officer left without a word. Elijah studied the envelope for several seconds before placing it beside his book unopened. That simple decision created more questions than answers, because whatever waited inside clearly mattered. And somehow Elijah Brooks already seemed to know exactly what it contained. The envelope remained untouched for nearly an hour. That fact alone became the most discussed topic inside Cell Block D. In a place where mail represented connection to the outside world, nobody ignored official correspondence. Yet Elijah Brooks seemed completely unconcerned. He continued reading beneath the fluorescent lights while the sealed envelope rested beside his book. Several inmates walked past his table during the evening, each finding an excuse to glance at the government seal printed across the front. None learned anything useful. The mystery only deepened. Aaron Miller eventually approached. "You are really not going to open that?" he asked. Elijah looked at the envelope and smiled faintly. "It will still be there in 5 minutes. Most people would have opened it already. Most people are curious." Aaron laughed. "And you are not." Elijah carefully placed a bookmark between the pages of his novel. Curiosity is valuable. So is patience. The answer spread through the housing unit within minutes. By lights out, inmates were repeating it almost word for word. Nobody understood why. Yet somehow even Elijah's simplest comments sounded different. They lingered in people's minds long after the conversation ended. The next morning brought another surprise. During breakfast, Daniel Mercer entered the cafeteria carrying a folded newspaper from the library. He rarely paid attention to national news, but one article had captured his attention immediately. The headline referenced a federal ceremony honoring retired public servants whose work had remained classified for decades. Most of the article consisted of names and historical references. None seemed familiar, until Daniel reached the photograph accompanying the story. His pulse immediately quickened. There it was again, the same image he had glimpsed on television. This time the photograph appeared larger, clearer. Daniel stared at it for several seconds. A group of officials stood together outside a government building. The image appeared to be decades old. Many faces were difficult to identify. One was not. Daniel lowered the newspaper slowly. Across the cafeteria, Elijah sat alone near the window. Older now, grayer now, but unmistakably the same man. Daniel felt a chill travel down his spine. He looked back at the article. The caption beneath the photograph had been partially cropped during printing. Only a few words remained visible. National Security Advisory Program. Distinguished Service Recognition. Classified Contributions. Daniel read the line 3 times. Then a fourth. None of it made sense. Why would a man connected to something like that end up in Graystone Correctional Facility? More importantly, why was every record about him buried behind layers of restrictions? Throughout the day, Daniel wrestled with those questions. He considered approaching Elijah directly. He considered showing him the newspaper. In the end, he did neither. Something told him the old man already knew exactly what was in the article. Meanwhile, Officer Rebecca Hayes experienced a surprise of her own. During a routine administrative review, she noticed a visitor request scheduled for the following week. The request listed Elijah Brooks as the inmate being visited. That alone was unusual. What truly caught her attention was the authorization code attached to the request. She had never seen one like it. The clearance level exceeded anything normally required for prison visitation. Rebecca stared at the screen in disbelief. Whoever planned to visit Elijah possessed extraordinary access. She printed the request and locked it inside her desk drawer. By evening, rain clouds had finally cleared from the sky. The setting sun painted long golden shadows across the prison yard while inmates completed their final recreation period of the day. Elijah sat alone on a bench watching the horizon beyond the fences. For several minutes, he simply observed the fading light. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel Mercer approached and stopped a few feet away. Neither man spoke immediately. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Daniel looked toward the horizon and quietly said, "I think I know where I have seen you before." Elijah did not appear surprised. He continued watching the sunset for another moment before responding. "No," he said calmly. "You only think you do." Daniel frowned. The answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it raised 1,000 new questions. And for the first time since Elijah arrived at Graystone, Daniel began to suspect that the truth was far bigger than a hidden past. It might be something nobody inside those walls was prepared to understand. That night, sleep came slowly to cell block D. The conversation between Daniel Mercer and Elijah Brooks spread through the housing unit long after lights out. Nobody knew exactly what had been said. Prison rumors rarely needed facts. They survived on fragments. A glance, a gesture, a half-heard sentence. By morning, half the block believed Daniel had identified Elijah as some former government official. The other half believed he had uncovered something even bigger. Travis Cole dismissed most of the speculation publicly, but privately, he found himself paying closer attention than ever before. The old man had become impossible to ignore. During breakfast, Travis watched Elijah from across the cafeteria. The same routine, the same calm posture, the same quiet patience. Yet something else caught his attention. People were beginning to treat Elijah differently. Not with respect exactly. Not yet. But the casual mockery had vanished. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody made jokes when he entered a room. The atmosphere had shifted. And in prison, shifts like that mattered. They often signaled larger changes waiting beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Officer Rebecca Hayes continued studying the visitor authorization locked inside her desk drawer. The clearance code bothered her more every time she looked at it. Early that afternoon, she finally contacted a colleague at another facility who specialized in inmate transportation and federal coordination. She carefully described the code without mentioning Elijah by name. The response arrived less than an hour later. Rebecca read the message twice. Then a third time. The code was legitimate. Extremely legitimate. According to her colleague, it had only appeared a handful of times during his entire career. Usually, it accompanied senior government personnel or individuals connected to highly restricted operations. Rebecca leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Whatever Elijah Brooks had done during his life, it clearly extended far beyond anything listed in his prison records. Out in the recreation yard, another development quietly unfolded. Daniel Mercer sat alone reviewing the newspaper article again. This time he examined every detail, every face, every line of text. One sentence near the bottom finally caught his attention. The article mentioned a retired advisory group that had assisted multiple presidential administrations over several decades. Most names remained classified even today. Daniel lowered the newspaper slowly. His heartbeat quickened. He looked across the yard. Elijah sat beneath a shade structure reading as usual. The image from the photograph and the man sitting before him continued overlapping inside his mind. The resemblance no longer felt coincidental. Yet one question refused to leave him. If Elijah had once occupied such an important position, why was he here? The answer remained hidden behind walls nobody seemed able to penetrate. Late that afternoon, dark clouds gathered once again over Graystone Correctional Facility. Wind swept across the yard. Leaves tumbled against the perimeter fences. As inmates returned inside before the approaching storm, Elijah paused briefly near a window overlooking the prison entrance road. Several correctional officers noticed him standing there. He appeared to be watching something beyond the gates. Something nobody else could see. Aaron Miller eventually approached. "What are you looking at?" Elijah smiled faintly without turning around. "The future." Aaron laughed. "You always say things like that. Only when they are true." Before Aaron could ask another question, thunder rolled across the sky. The lights inside the housing unit flickered briefly. Conversations paused. For just a moment, an uneasy feeling settled over the block. Then the lights stabilized and life resumed. Yet Elijah continued watching the entrance road. Calm, patient, certain, as though he already knew something was coming. Something that would change everything. And somewhere beyond the prison walls, a black government vehicle had already begun the long drive toward Graystone. The black vehicle arrived just after sunrise. Most inmates never saw it. The prison's outer entrance sat far beyond the housing units, hidden behind layers of fencing, security checkpoints, and administrative buildings. Yet the arrival sent a ripple through Graystone Correctional Facility almost immediately. Officers who normally moved with routine confidence suddenly seemed more alert. Supervisors appeared on housing units where they rarely visited. Radios crackled more frequently than usual. Something was happening. Nobody knew what. Inside cell block D, breakfast proceeded as normal. Trays slid across counters. Coffee steamed beneath fluorescent lights. Conversations drifted through the cafeteria. Elijah Brooks sat alone near the window, calmly reading a newspaper someone had left behind. If he noticed the unusual activity around him, he gave no sign. Across the room, Travis Cole noticed everything. Years of experience had sharpened his instincts. He watched two senior administrators walk through the cafeteria together. That alone was unusual. Then he noticed Deputy Warden Frank Simmons speaking quietly with a lieutenant near the entrance. Even more unusual, prison routines did not change without reason. Travis leaned toward one of his associates. "Something is going on." The man nodded. "I heard extra security came in this morning." Travis glanced toward Elijah. For reasons he could not explain, his attention kept returning to the old man. Meanwhile, Officer Rebecca Hayes received confirmation she had been expecting. The visitor request scheduled for Elijah Brooks had officially arrived. Yet the details stunned her. The visitor was not family, not a lawyer, not a journalist. The name listed on the authorization belonged to a retired federal official whose public biography alone filled several pages. Rebecca read the file twice before looking out the office window. None of it made sense. Why would someone of that stature travel hundreds of miles to visit an elderly inmate? More importantly, why had every effort to understand Elijah's past been blocked? Questions continued piling up faster than answers. By mid-morning, rumors had already spread throughout cell block D. Some inmates believed federal investigators had arrived. Others claimed a politician was visiting the prison. A few insisted a major transfer operation was underway. Nobody knew the truth. Yet everyone sensed that something important was unfolding behind closed doors. Daniel Mercer spent most of the morning watching Elijah. He expected signs of anticipation, nervousness, curiosity. Instead, Elijah remained exactly as he always was. Calm, patient, focused. Around 11 o'clock, a correctional officer entered the housing unit carrying a clipboard. Conversations immediately quieted. The officer walked directly toward Elijah's table. "Brooks," he said, "you have a visitor." Every eye in the room turned. Elijah slowly closed his newspaper and stood. No surprise crossed his face. No confusion. It was almost as if he had known this moment was coming. Aaron Miller watched in disbelief. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. Elijah smiled. "Some appointments are made long before they appear on a schedule." Then he followed the officer toward the exit. The room remained silent until the door closed behind him. Only then did the whispers begin. Travis stared at the empty doorway. Daniel stared as well. Neither man spoke. Both were thinking the same thing. Whatever mystery surrounded Elijah Brooks was finally beginning to move. Elsewhere in the prison, Rebecca Hayes positioned herself near the administrative corridor under the pretense of completing paperwork. Several minutes later, she saw Elijah enter the visitation wing. Waiting inside the secured conference room stood an elderly man in a dark suit accompanied by two security personnel. The moment the visitor saw Elijah, he immediately stood. Then something happened that Rebecca never expected. The distinguished visitor extended his hand with visible respect. Not polite respect, genuine respect. The kind reserved for people whose names carry weight. Elijah accepted the handshake warmly. The conference room door closed before Rebecca could hear a single word. But one thing had become unmistakably clear. Whoever Elijah Brooks truly was, he was not merely an old prisoner with a mysterious file. He was someone important enough that powerful people still came looking for him. The meeting lasted nearly 90 minutes. Inside cell block D, that fact alone became another source of endless speculation. Ordinary visits rarely stretched beyond a few minutes. This one continued through lunch and into the early afternoon. By the time Elijah Brooks finally returned, nearly every inmate in the housing unit noticed. Yet what surprised them most was not the length of the meeting. It was Elijah's expression afterward. Nothing had changed. He carried the same calm presence, the same measured pace, the same quiet confidence. Whatever had been discussed behind those closed doors, it had not disturbed him in the slightest. Officer Rebecca Hayes watched from the control station as Elijah crossed the housing unit. Curiosity burned stronger than ever. She had spent days searching for answers. Now she knew she had been asking the wrong questions. The mystery was not why Elijah's records were restricted. The mystery was how someone connected to powerful government officials had ended up in a state prison at all. As Elijah passed her station, Rebecca finally spoke. "Everything go well?" Elijah paused and offered a polite smile. "It was good to see an old friend." Rebecca hesitated. That man seemed important. Elijah looked toward the upper tier before answering. "Everyone is important to someone." Then he continued walking. Once again, he had answered without truly answering. Across the housing unit, Daniel Mercer noticed something else. The envelope Elijah had received days earlier was gone. So was the newspaper article. Small details, yet somehow significant. Daniel's instincts told him pieces of a larger picture were finally beginning to connect. Later that evening, an unexpected event occurred in the prison library. The elderly volunteer who managed the books was sorting donations when she accidentally dropped a stack of old magazines onto the floor. Several pages scattered across the room. Elijah immediately stepped forward to help. Together they gathered the papers in silence until one particular magazine slid across the floor and stopped near Elijah's shoes. The cover displayed a photograph taken nearly 30 years earlier. A group of advisors stood beside a United States president during an international conference. The image was faded with age. Most people would have ignored it. The volunteer did not. As Elijah handed the magazine back to her, her eyes widened. She looked from the photograph to Elijah, then back again. For several seconds, she said nothing. Finally, she whispered, "That is you." Elijah glanced at the cover. The faintest smile appeared on his face. "A very long time ago." The volunteer stared in disbelief. "You worked with them?" Elijah carefully placed the remaining magazines onto a shelf. "I worked with many people." Before she could ask another question, he picked up his book and quietly left the library. The volunteer remained frozen in place. The encounter spread quickly, not because Elijah told anyone. The volunteer never intended to gossip. Yet shock has a way of finding its own path. By evening, whispers moved through Graystone Correctional Facility faster than ever before. Some inmates claimed Elijah had advised presidents. Others insisted he had served as a diplomat. A few believed he had worked for intelligence agencies. Nobody knew which story was true. For the first time, however, the rumors contained something they had never possessed before. Evidence. A photograph. A witness. A connection to the outside world. As darkness settled beyond the prison walls, Daniel sat alone reviewing everything he had learned. The photograph. The visitor. The classified records. The government vehicle. None of it pointed toward an ordinary life. Meanwhile, Elijah sat quietly at his table reading beneath the fluorescent lights. Around him, conversations continued. Questions multiplied. The mystery deepened. Yet Elijah appeared completely unconcerned. Almost as if he had spent a lifetime carrying secrets. And almost as if he knew that sooner or later, the truth would reveal itself without any help from him at all. The following morning began with an energy unlike anything Graystone Correctional Facility had experienced in years. Word of the photograph had spread far beyond Cell Block D. Correctional officers discussed it quietly in break rooms. Administrative staff exchanged curious glances in hallways. Even inmates who had never spoken to Elijah Brooks now found themselves watching him whenever he entered a room. Yet the man at the center of the attention remained completely unchanged. He arrived at breakfast at the same time. He carried the same paperback novel beneath his arm. He thanked the cafeteria worker who handed him his tray. It was as though the growing fascination surrounding him belonged to someone else entirely. Aaron Miller sat across from him that morning, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "People are saying all kinds of things now," he said. Elijah looked up from his coffee. "People usually do. But some of them might be true." Elijah smiled faintly. "Some might." Aaron leaned forward. "Were you really connected to presidents?" For a moment, Elijah seemed to consider the question carefully. Then he set down his cup. "Aaron, if a person spends his entire life chasing titles, he often forgets what actually matters. And if he spends his entire life running from them, he never learns what they were worth." Aaron blinked. "I'm not sure that answered anything." "It answered more than you think." Nearby, several inmates listened closely. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. The atmosphere had transformed completely from the day Elijah first arrived. Across the room, Travis Cole noticed it too. For years, he had been the center of gravity inside cell block D. Now conversations shifted whenever Elijah entered. Not because Elijah demanded attention, because mystery naturally attracted it. Travis found the change increasingly difficult to ignore. Later that afternoon, Officer Rebecca Hayes received another surprise. While reviewing archived prison correspondence, she discovered a memorandum attached to Elijah's transfer records. The document had been hidden beneath multiple authorization layers. Most of the information remained redacted. Yet one sentence survived untouched. Inmate possesses documented history of national service at the highest advisory levels. Rebecca stared at the screen. There it was. Not a rumor. Not speculation. Official confirmation. The old man sitting in cell block D had once occupied positions few Americans would ever reach. She leaned back slowly. The realization felt almost unreal. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer spent the afternoon in the library searching through old magazines and newspapers. The deeper he looked, the more fragments appeared. A blurred photograph from an international summit. A reference to a strategic advisory panel. Mentions of unnamed specialists who assisted government leaders during difficult moments in history. Elijah's name never appeared directly, yet somehow his shadow seemed present in all of them. By evening, the housing unit had become unusually quiet. Inmates still talked. Television still played. Card games continued. But beneath everything lingered a growing sense of respect. Not because anyone fully understood who Elijah Brooks was. Quite the opposite. The more they learned, the more they realized how little they actually knew. As the sun disappeared beyond the prison walls, Elijah sat near the upper railing overlooking the block. The fading orange light filtered through the narrow windows and reflected across the concrete floor. For several minutes, he simply watched the horizon. Then Aaron approached again. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked softly. Elijah turned toward him. "Miss what?" "Whatever life you had before this place." The old man remained silent for a moment. Then he looked back toward the sunset. "Every life leaves something behind," he said. "The important question is whether what you left behind still matters." Aaron followed his gaze toward the distant horizon. Before he could respond, the evening count announcement echoed through the housing unit. Doors began opening. Conversations shifted. Another ordinary prison night was beginning. Yet nobody inside cell block D could shake the feeling that the truth about Elijah Brooks was closer than ever. And when it finally emerged, it would change the way every person in that building understood him forever. The truth finally arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. No announcement echoed through the prison. No television crew appeared at the gates. No dramatic speech interrupted the daily routine. Instead, it began with a single official document delivered to the administration office. Officer Rebecca Hayes happened to be present when the envelope arrived. The paperwork contained authorization for the release of previously restricted information concerning Elijah Brooks. She read the first page once, then twice. By the third reading, she understood why so many records had been hidden. For more than 4 decades, Elijah Brooks had served as a senior strategic advisor to multiple administrations, military leaders, and international humanitarian organizations. His work had influenced decisions during national emergencies, diplomatic crises, and disaster response efforts around the world. Much of his service remained classified even now. The prison sentence that brought him to Graystone had stemmed from a complicated legal dispute involving confidential government records, a case that many experts still debated. Yet the document made one thing perfectly clear. Elijah Brooks was not a forgotten old man. He was a man whose guidance had shaped events far beyond anything most people could imagine. By lunchtime, the information had reached Deputy Warden Simmons. By mid-afternoon, it had spread through the staff. And by evening, Cell Block D knew the truth. The reaction was unlike anything the housing unit had experienced before. Conversations stopped whenever Elijah entered a room. Not because people feared him, because they finally understood how wrong they had been. Aaron Miller sat beside him during dinner and simply shook his head. "All this time," he said quietly. "All this time, you never told anyone." Elijah smiled. "Nobody asked the right question." Aaron laughed. "What was the right question?" Elijah looked around the cafeteria. "Not who I was. Why I am still trying to become a better person." The answer lingered in Aaron's mind long after the conversation ended. Across the room, Travis Cole remained unusually silent. For days he had resisted the rumors. For days he had dismissed the mystery. Now the facts stood in front of him. The elderly inmate he once viewed as insignificant had earned the respect of presidents, generals, diplomats, and leaders across the world. Yet Elijah never bragged about any of it. He never demanded recognition. He never used his past to elevate himself above others. Somehow that impressed Travis more than the achievements themselves. Later that evening, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the upper tier, Elijah stood near the railing overlooking the housing unit. The same place where he often watched the horizon beyond the fences. One by one, inmates continued their routines below. Some nodded respectfully as they passed. Others offered quiet greetings. The atmosphere had transformed completely from the day he arrived. The laughter was gone. The assumptions were gone. In their place stood understanding. Daniel Mercer eventually approached and stopped beside him. "I knew there was something different about you," he said. Elijah chuckled softly. "There is something different about everyone, Daniel. Most people are simply too busy judging to notice." For a moment, neither man spoke. The sounds of the housing unit drifted upward. Televisions, conversations, footsteps, ordinary prison life continuing as always. Finally, Daniel looked toward the horizon and asked, "After everything you accomplished, what matters most now?" Elijah watched the fading sunlight for several seconds before answering. "Character." Daniel frowned. "More than success?" "Success fades." Elijah smiled. "Titles fade. Power fades. Reputation fades. Character is what remains when everything else disappears." As darkness settled beyond the prison walls, the words spread quietly through cell block D. Some heard them directly. Others heard them secondhand. Yet everyone seemed to understand the lesson. The old man they once dismissed had never needed their approval. His worth had existed long before he entered Graystone Correctional Facility. And in the end, the greatest surprise was not who Elijah Brooks had been. It was who he remained.